So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of First Amendment Museum Unscripted. I'm Max Nospish, the Manager of Education and Visitor Experiences here at the First Amendment Museum in Augusta, Maine. One thing we talk quite a bit about here is hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, and with the rise of anti-Semitism rhetoric and attacks here in the US, we wanted to do something that was maybe a little more practical, sort of a how-to guide to respond to Holocaust denialism and distortion. So I've gathered a group of experts here. We're going to talk about Holocaust denialism, distortion, and revisionism. And then we're going to get into some specific claims that you might see online. I, unfortunately, have seen many of the claims on my list here. We'll have our panel of experts hopefully destroy them all. So Michael, go ahead, introduce yourself.
I am the publisher of Skeptic Magazine. It looks like this. It's a print magazine, also available on digital form, available in any fine bookstore. We cover different topics. It's a quarterly. We did one on economics, this one on nationalism. We did one on race. So we take on all kinds of controversial topics. And that's my day job, one of which was, back in the 90s, Holocaust denial, or as they call themselves, Holocaust revisionism, whatever you call it. What's the claims that are being made and what can we say about it through science, scholarship, and so forth. And so this is just one of many topics that we cover, just, literally hundreds. We've been in business for 30 years. And we're always interested in topics that we can address directly with evidence when the claims are made. So we like to actually steel man the other person's position, say this is what the claim is, and here is what the response is. And we do that for vaccine denial or climate denial or whatever, evolution denial, and of course Holocaust denial.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. And Robert.
Great. I'm Robert Bernheim. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Maine at Augusta, where I focus on Holocaust and Genocide studies. I've been in education for over 3.5 decades, so grassroots level. Started out as a high school social studies and German teacher in Maine and Vermont, and have worked as the head of a nonprofit in Maine for a Holocaust and Human Rights Center, as well as Holocaust Center at the University of Vermont. So I deal with Holocaust denial and distortion really, again, the grassroots level in the classroom with students who either are Holocaust deniers, have parents that are Holocaust deniers, and present all kinds of challenges to the classroom setting and how do we deal with these lies and distortion. So looking forward to the panel.
Excellent. Thank you. And Ellen.
I'm Ellen Germain. I'm the Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues at the U.S. Department of State. So I am a career Foreign Service officer, a career diplomat, and my office deals with issues of Holocaust era restitution and compensation, and we also support and advocate for accurate Holocaust commemoration and education worldwide. So I don't deal necessarily directly with countering Holocaust distortion and denial, but countering Holocaust distortion and denial is definitely something that we're focused on and that we try to work with international colleagues on to find ways that, how can governments try to address this and other kinds of hate speech? So it's an area that we're trying to get more and more involved in.
Excellent. Thank you all for joining us. As I say in all of these First Amendment Unscripted episodes, a lot of these topics, it's really hard to find people who are willing to speak about it, especially to volunteer their time and effort to do it. So these three people are rock stars. And if anybody's out there that watching this feels like their viewpoint is not being represented, please email me, as always, at mnospish@firstamendmentmuseum.com, and we'll see what we can do. So thank you guys so much for being here. So I just want to jump right in, and Ellen, I think I mentioned this earlier before you hopped on. This is sort of a free-for-all, so we'll just sort of and I might call on you guys individually, but for most of the part, I'll just be sort of just jump in whenever. I want to start off by asking, what is Holocaust denialism, distortion, apology, revisionism? What is that?
I guess I could start off just the simplest 3 points that I discuss in my book on this and lectures. The denial that 6 million Jews were killed in World War II. that therefore the gas chambers and other means of killing were fraudulent or not really used in any systematic way. And then, therefore, 3, there was no intention on the part of the Nazi regime to exterminate European Jewry. Whatever deaths there are, however many there are, and they estimate range between like 500,000 and 1 million, but not 6 million, that these are just accidental deaths or deaths due to disease, overwork, starvation, war disease, war cause deaths, things like that. So the denial of that is literally Holocaust denial. And those 3 points, they're wrong in all those.
Does anybody want to jump in on that?
Sure. I would add from kind of again, classroom perspective, anything that erases the Holocaust as history is really obliterates the facts of the Holocaust. That to me reeks of denial. The distortion is the misrepresentation part that we've also encountered that Michael's mentioned in, kind of the anti-vaccine kind of comparisons that have happened during COVID, all of those things. And I'm sure that Ellen has dealt with this as well. So I think the erasure of Holocaust history to me is really about, is Holocaust denial in a nutshell. And then the distortion is the misrepresentation. And all of it fits under the guise of anti-Semitism, as far as I'm concerned. So,
yeah, and I will just add that, yeah, Holocaust denial and distortion, I mean, that is a form of anti-Semitism. And on Holocaust distortion, the other thing that we find we're looking at and trying to address more and more is this question of historical revisionism or rehabilitation. That is, the efforts of some countries of mostly Central or Eastern Europe to rewrite their history of World War II and what happened during the Holocaust, downplay local collaborations, rehabilitate people as national heroes who were also complicit in, acts of Nazi genocide. So that's also Holocaust distortion.
When did Holocaust denialism, distortion, I'll just use the term Holocaust denialism for the rest of the panel, but all of those things we've mentioned, when did this begin?
During the war.
Mm-hmm.
Look, you have again, context for us is queen or king, whatever you want to call it, as historians. And you had a very strong pro-German lobby pre-World War II. Charles Lindbergh among those voices that really were kind of pushing Germany is good, they're doing good things. And think about it, 1/4 of American white people in the pre-war era are descended from Germans, German immigrants. So there is this tendency to have this kind of filio-German attitude. And also, when people are reading, and I think one of Ellen's colleagues, Deborah Lipstadt, wrote about this, when World War I editors after the war admitted that they exaggerated the claims of German atrocities in the First World War, a lot of people said, well, they just lied to us then, they're lying to us now. If they said they crucified cats on church doors in Belgium and that wasn't true, that the Huns, the Germans did this, and the Germans couldn't really be doing all this killing. And so public opinion too blamed the Japanese first and foremost for the war. And Pearl Harbor was initiated by the Japanese, not the Germans. And public opinion, Roper polls and other public opinion polls didn't really shift until the Battle of the Bulge in December of 44, January 45, that painted the Germans in kind of very nefarious ways. And so obviously there's a lot of things going on here, and I'm being kind of simplistic, but I would submit that during the war, are the seeds of denial are already there, and kind of relativization of German actions. And then after the war, certainly this idea that the Germans bombed the heck out of countries, Dresden and Hamburg, kind of held up as supposed war crimes, and 600,000 German civilians killed, or up to 600,000, 2 million German women raped. So Allied atrocities kind of trying to basically cut the Holocaust down to size is just part of war, and all the hell that is war is something that happens as the war is unfolding, but then certainly after the war.
I would also add, if I can, it also started with the Germans. Hitler himself, they called it the final solution. They were not calling it the murder of Europe's Jews. All of the, the fake shower heads, all of the stories that were told to Jews who were being deported to the East, to labor camps. All of this was, again, a form of Holocaust denial, an effort to conceal and deny what was really happening.
Yeah, I would add some larger perspective too, that the idea of genocide is relatively new. The term itself was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1945. The idea of crimes against humanity, again, that just didn't come up until the Nuremberg trials. And, that in historical perspectives, most people didn't think genocide was all that bad as long as it didn't happen to them, right? As long as it's the other guys, then who cares? It's only really Holocaust denial becomes a thing when you actually have to deny it because it's clear that this is a crime. So that really, there's kind of a gray area there immediately after the war where the perpetrators then started having to cover over their tracks. Although even there, Mengele, before he scurried off to South America, he thought he would return home. The Mengele family was fairly wealthy and well known in Germany, and he thought he'd just go back and be something of a hero. He didn't really think what he did was all that bad until it became clear that some of these other perpetrators were being convicted. So that's when he jumped on the rat line to South America and started covering his tracks. And that was true for a lot of the Nazis. They just didn't really think, had they won, well, we'd be trying the Americans for their bombing of Hamburg and Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki rather than vice versa. It's just a matter of who happened to have won. Today, of course, we consider crimes against humanity as a real crime, and and if we could put Putin on the docket after whatever happens here, we probably would, although that's not likely to happen, I suppose. But that idea that it could is relatively new.
So,
sorry, Max, I just would add to Michael's comment there to provide another kind of bigger picture. It's the Cold War, and the Germans are the vanquished, and the real enemy is the communism in the Soviet Union. And so you see this even in the publication of books by tank commanders or German generals get a big play, and all of a sudden, you've got people that were bringing Nazi scientists to this country as part of a concerted effort to, win the space race and other things. So there is a governmental top-down kind of tamping down of this idea of the Germans as bad people and the Germans as perpetrators, because that's all done. That's the past. Let's not look at the past anymore. We have the present and the future, and the communists are the big ogres of the future. Nazism is dead.
I want to ask, so why have I seen and heard more Holocaust denialism in the past year, 2 years, 3 years, especially online? Even in person, I've heard some people make Holocaust denialist claims. Why have I seen, it seems like I've experienced a rise in that. Is there any truth to that perception, or is that just me?
Oh, well, there may be some availability heuristic there of just what comes across your desk and it pops into mind. Although I think it's probably wrapped up in the recent spike in anti-Semitism. That the statistics on that hate crimes related to Jews is definitely on the rise in the last maybe 2 to 3 years. So it could be wrapped up in some of that. It's never really gone away, after the David Irving trial when he sued Deborah Lipstadt. In England, and he lost, and it was a devastating destruction of those arguments. That pretty much.
I want to put a pin right here. What is the David Irving trial, and who is Deborah Lipstadt?
Deborah Lipstadt wrote a book on the Holocaust deniers, and she called David Irving a Holocaust denier, not a revisionist, which is what he called himself. And David was a reasonably successful writer of books of history, mostly of World War II, mostly from the German perspective. He wrote books on Hitler, Hitler's War, Goebbels, Himmler, and so on. And he was relatively successful, not an academic historian, just a professional writer. And he claims after Deborah's book came out that publishers basically ran away from him when he approached, as he described it. And there may be some truth to that, whatever. That's just the way it goes. If you're going to put yourself out there and promote and write about something that's false, publishers have every right to not publish your stuff. This is not a First Amendment free speech issue. I don't have to publish ads from the Holocaust Deniers in Skeptic magazine, and they've tried to place ads in my magazine. I'm not required to do so. It's not a free speech issue. They're free to publish their newsletters and self-published books or whatever, as is David Irving, but we're not forced to publish them or buy them, right? So he lost, just completely destroyed by Lipstadt's team, mainly Richard Evans, the great British historian of World War II. Basically, he and his grad students went through everything Irving ever wrote, and all his footnotes and everything, and they showed the distortion and errors that he made. And he said, well, all historians make errors. Yeah, but all of your errors go in one direction, right? That's how you know if it's fraud versus error in any kind of scientific investigation of scientific fraud. For example, if you go through a scientist data set, you'll find errors if you look close enough, but the errors are scattershot. If the errors are all in one direction to support a particular hypothesis, then it's probably fraud. That's how we decide that. And that was the case with Irving. All of his errors were in one direction. So that was that.
And Ellen, someone mentioned that you worked with Deborah Lipstadt, or you know her personally. Is there anything you want to add on to that?
So Deborah is now the State Department Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, and she has been since the trial and before, a really powerful voice on all of these issues, on countering anti-Semitism, on speaking out against all forms of anti-Semitism, including Holocaust distortion and denial. I would just say on the David Irving trial, the one thing that has always struck me about it, and I was in London at our embassy at the U.S. Embassy in London when that trial was going on, and was actually covering it, as it were, for the embassy. We're not reporters, we don't cover, but I was tracking it as it was happening. And one of the things, after the trial, it's just as Michael said, David Irving's argument was destroyed, right? It was conclusively, the judge said, clearly, these are Holocaust denial. Deborah's team's arguments are correct, and you are wrong. David Irving remained a Holocaust distortionist and denier after that. I mean, the facts did not change his mind. So a real question for me is, it's one of the questions that we struggle with, is what can we do? How can we address this? What can we actually do to counter Holocaust denial and distortion?
Yeah, well, so you do what we do, just line up all their facts and refute their claims and refute them. Beyond that, David, so there's an interesting side story here. I called him a Holocaust denier in print, in Skeptic magazine, in my book Denying History. He never sued me. He liked me because I was nice to him, and I'm not Jewish, and I'm kind of an independent researcher to that extent, and I met him and I spent time with him. We went out to dinner together. I bought him a beer, so they kind of open up and tell you what they're really thinking. And what he was really thinking was, the traditional enemy, are doing this to me. Well, who is that? Well, of course, it's the Jews are doing this to him. So he went after Lipstadt because she's Jewish, because she's the face of the Jewish rebuttal to Holocaust denial. That's why he did that. I'm sure of it. And the fact that, the counter arguments and facts presented in the trial changed his mind not one bit, is a further indication he's not a fair, honest player. He's not. He's just a professional contrarian or an anti-Semite.
Not good faith.
He's just not. I mean, he had this whole thing, no holes, no Holocaust, that there's no holes in the crematoria ceilings at Cremus 2 and 3 and 4 at Auschwitz. Therefore, the Zyklon B pellets could not have been poured through these induction ports, through these holes on the roof of the gas chambers, and so on.
And I want to, we'll address the individual claims, but Robert, I want you to take on that question before we get into those individual claims. Why does it feel like Holocaust denialism and anti-Semitism has been on the rise the past couple of years?
So again, it's my own perspective from just someone who's teaching students is that I've seen this again, as I think Ellen and Michael have noted. I would submit that part of it is a reflection of our political times as well, when you have leaders who talk about alternative facts and try to push an agenda that is false, gives an opening, an opportunity. And whether this is true, you know, we see this in the United States, but we also see it in parts of Europe, the rise of kind of authoritarian type leaders in European nations and around the globe, that there's almost an opportunity that says it's okay, you know, you can talk about this. This goes beyond these First Amendment issues that Michael and Ellen were speaking about, and I think it's set from a tone that comes in us in our culture, that you have to have our social media things, TikTok, just, you know, has to, Facebook, all these, Twitter, they're either monitoring or they're not monitoring. They're getting accused of these things, of allowing this flood of information. So part of it's our technology age, part of it's our political climate, I would submit. And I think these are topics that lend themselves to kind of a conversation, this controversial, contrarian, as Michael was talking about, idea that, you know, I had a Holocaust denier as a student in a high school that I taught, and his parents were strong deniers, very much, I would say, libertarian in the sense that I had a Holocaust survivor come and speak, and they demanded of the principal that I bring a Holocaust denier to class, because after all, in their argument, in the marketplace of ideas, you should be able to provide the kids the opportunity to hear both sides of the story. And the argument was there are two legitimate sides of the story, when there's not two legitimate sides of the story. But that was in a high school classroom, a small community, and yet that kind of thing has been, we have permission, it seems, from our political leaders and those who are not carrying on a very civil public discourse and are repeating things that are absolutely false and using false comparisons and, you know, what Deborah Lipstadt calls the yes, but syndrome. Yeah, Hitler was bad, but I teach in the Maine State Prison, and I had a sergeant say, well, you know, Hitler did some bad things, but he made these Autobahns. And when I was stationed there as a soldier, it was great. We could get around places. And so he didn't do all these bad things. And he didn't really know about the Holocaust. I mean, that kind of rationale and yes, but stuff is I think, made more possible today by our environment and our technology, is my.
Yeah. Does anybody want to add on to that before we get into some individual claims?
Well, the strategies that they employ are very common in other areas that we deal with at Skeptic, like climate denial, vaccine denial, and so on. One is called anomaly hunting. So anomaly hunting is when you just look through whatever it is you're investigating and you find anything that isn't quite fully explained by the mainstream theory. You know, how do you explain this thing here? How do you explain that thing over there? As if you could refute an entire theory based on a couple of these anomalies. And the problem is that no theory explains absolutely every fact that you can find. 9/11 truthers, you know, well, what about this guy? And what about that thing over there? Right. And so all your points that you sent us, and, and when I first met the deniers, they gave me a list of 39 unanswered questions by Holocaust historians. Right. And so I went through, and, a lot of the historians I talked to, they didn't know the answers to these things, because why would they? They're really quirky, weird anomalies. Like, why doesn't the door at the gas chamber at Mauthausen lock? Right. So my co-author, Alex Grobman, and I wrote this book, Denying History. We went to all the camps. We went to Mauthausen. So I'm looking at this door, like, okay, here's the gas chamber. Here's the door. And okay, yeah, it doesn't seem to lock. And it's one of these kind of handles like this, and a slot comes up into the door handle like that. Right. And it didn't do it. So I'm like, that's really weird, Alex. Okay, now I'm going to get in there and I'm going to see if I can push through, push out. Yeah, you can push it. Well, how is this possible to gas people, right? If the door doesn't lock, and I asked the guy doesn't know. I asked the guy's boss doesn't know. I finally get the head of the whole Mauthausen complex museum there. They didn't know. This person didn't know. And before I know it, I'm on the phone with the minister of the interior of all of Austria, who's in charge of all their parks and memorials and things like this. And he's like, what's this about the door doesn't lock? I'm like, yeah, that's kind of weird. And I had to make it clear, we're not here as Holocaust deniers. Like, we just want to get the answer to that one little fact. Okay. It took me like 2 years to finally figure out that the original door was taken off and it was sent to some museum. in Hungary or somewhere, I forget now. And then they just stuck some other door on there just later. Okay. But why would that matter? All right. This is like the no holes, no Holocaust. Why is that? Well, because if that one is fake, then they're all fake, or this was reconstructed. Irving always makes a big point about at Auschwitz I, the original Polish army barracks, where there was a gas chamber. They reconstructed it after the war. The Russians did, right? So you go there and the sign says this is where they gas people or whatever. And, at the time, the sign didn't say this is a reconstruction by the Russians after the war, blah, 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 right? So, people like Irving go there with their cameras and go, look, they said this is the gas chamber, but it's a fake, and they have like 50 things like that, right? And they ignore the 10,000 bits of information that supports the main theory of what happened in the Holocaust, right? So that's one of their strategies.
Right. And so I want to get into some individual claims because I feel like doing so it's an unfortunate conversation, but I feel like it's important to do so because when I saw a lot of these claims online, I sort of had an experience similar to what you described, Michael. I couldn't find any actual answers to some of the Holocaust denialist arguments. Like I looked everywhere. I've spent probably more time looking than most people do when they hear something like that. And I was having a really hard time finding answers to specific claims. And I feel like when people cannot find answers to those claims, it breeds suspicion and it breeds doubt. And so I want to address some of these claims up front. So you guys have, so the first claim is that the Holocaust is merely Allied propaganda meant to demonize Nazi Germany. How do we refute that claim?
Well, just to look at the Nuremberg trials, it was, just trying the actual perpetrators who did things or gave orders or, made it happen, not to demonize the entire German people. In fact, the whole Marshall Plan was to rebuild Germany and help them return to a democracy and so on. There was no demonization of the German people, right? It was just the denazification of the regime.
Anybody else want to add to this one?
Things we mentioned earlier about the context of this whole thing about Allied propaganda earlier with the newspaper editors. But one of the things I'm reminded of is Chris Bohjalian's author, wrote lots of books that received a lot of recognition, and a fiction writer. But he also wrote a book called The Sandcastle Girls, which is near and dear to his heart, about the Armenian genocide. And he was asked by students in my university and other universities, constantly asked this question as to when it comes to denial by the Turkish government about the Armenian genocide, there's often comparison made to the Germans. And one of the answers that he gives quotes a Holocaust survivor who basically said, ask the Germans themselves. The Germans themselves, the German government, the Germans do not deny that genocide was carried out in the name of the government of the Third Reich. And they don't deny that, versus other nations where genocide denial is commonplace. So I think we go back to see, what did the Germans actually say about what happened? And is that Allied propaganda, or is that simply people stating the truth? And obviously there's nuances and issues about this, in West Germany before the wall came down. Is it Richard von Weizsäcker in his 40th anniversary speech on May 8th, 1985, that first time the German government actually admits to crimes? There are all kinds of hair splitting that we could do, but at least the German government didn't say, no, this never happened prior to us here, West German government. Even the East Germans didn't say that either. So I think it's, again, context is queen or king, and we need that context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get Ellen. Go ahead, Ellen. Sorry, Michael.
No, I just want of course, I agree with everything that Michael and Robert just said. And this question of, first going back to the actual evidence, there are mounds of eyewitness testimony of eyewitnesses who liberated the camps, eyewitnesses, survivors who survived the camps, those rare few handful who managed to escape and bring eyewitness testimony during the war about what was going on in the ghettos and the camps, and all the documentary evidence. I mean, the Holocaust is the best documented genocide in history. So, for why do we believe, or why would anyone believe someone who simply says no, it didn't happen, without providing any kind of evidence, or as Michael said, provides one or two errors in these hundreds of thousands, millions of documents and other forms of evidence.
So, go ahead, Michael. And then I want to move on.
I'll add parenthetically, my wife is from Cologne, Germany. She's German, and she says, when she was growing up in school, they not only did they not deny it, they said, look, we did this, and we are never, ever, ever going to do this again, right? I mean, it was quite clear, this was a huge mistake, right? So, yeah, that's right.
So I guess the response to that claim would be, it's not just the Allies that were making claims and providing evidence for the Holocaust. A lot of it came from the Germans, from the historical record, from the mounds of evidence, and from German memory even today, how they remember it.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, German diplomats today, I am always impressed when I am at, international meetings, or I'm talking to my German colleagues. Always at some point or another end up saying, or sometimes they start whatever they're saying by saying, yes, we Germans are responsible for the Holocaust. We committed this. It's unambiguous.
So I want to give a claim that I've never heard before, but see if you guys have a response to it. Not a single document has been found with Hitler's signature ordering the extermination of the Jewish people in Europe.
Yeah, I have a whole section on that in my book. During the 1930s, with the euthanasia program, the Nazi regime was getting bad press, particularly via both the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, that this was really wrong. They should not be doing this. It's inhumane and so forth. And at that point, and we have some documentation on this, where the Nazis said, all right, we're not going to put any of this in writing. No one's going to sign anything, and they're going to use coded language and so on. And that is what they did. At the famous Poznan speech in 1944, when Himmler gave almost a 3-hour speech to all the kind of leading SS officers about what they were doing. And, he kind of got to give them a pep talk, because there was a lot of theft and corruption in the system, and people were slacking off, and they, everybody had a good Jew they didn't want to kill, and on and on. He's kind of trying to override it. But in there, he says, we are going to now, he's talking about other stuff, and he says, we are now going to talk about this other thing that we are never going to mention. No one's ever going to put this in writing, but centuries from now, we're going to be heroes for doing this. I'm talking about the extermination of the Jews, and this is never to be put in writing. So that's why, it's that he didn't write it down doesn't mean you can't give the order. That it's like, you're not going to find orders in print from mafia dons to kill somebody, right? It's just the followers know what the boss wants done once the system gets set up in place. And that we do have documentation from the Wannsee conference, where they made it absolutely clear, here are the number of Jews that are there, and in 1939, here is our goal, is to get rid of all 10 or 11 million of them, and here's how we're going to do it. That was pretty clear.
Which brings me to my next claim. The estimates of Jewish losses during the Holocaust are greatly exaggerated, and this is a quote. There were never even 6 million Jews in Germany during the 1930s and 40s. So how
Germany,
6 million?
European Jewry was much more than that. But here's an example of another one of their strategies that pseudoscientists also use is you take a claim like, the historians themselves don't agree on how many people were killed. So this guy says it's 5.1. This other historian says it's 6.2. Somebody else says it's 6.9 million. Look, they can't even get their story straight, right? In fact, if every Holocaust historian gave the exact same number killed, I would then suspect that they're all operating from one source. But in fact, and I have a printed table in my book of all the different estimates of how many Jews there were before the war, how many Jews there were in every single little town and hamlet and city and so on, how many were there before, how many were there after. And of course, no one has a perfect number, right? So the fact that the numbers don't line up, but they all are in this range, there's an error bar range, again, between 5.1 million and say 6.3 million or so. That tells me that that is the truth. Somewhere in there is the truth. It's probably right in the middle, whatever. But and that's real revisionism, right? The number goes up, it goes down, it does this because we get more information. That's what historians are supposed to do. That's not. But the deniers go, look, they can't get their story straight. That's why we know they're lying. No, the opposite.
So, Robert, do you have anything that you'd like to add to address the two claims that I just laid out?
Sure. I think, what Michael noted was really important, and as part of the euthanasia program, back to your question about no Hitler signature, and the Nazis, of course, we do have a document that was signed with Hitler's signature from his secretary, Martin Bormann, in July of 1943, that basically says we're going to ban the use of the word Gesamtlösung, which is comprehensive or complete solution to the Jewish question. We are not to mention. So you have a top-down order that says we're not going to talk about this. And that Posen speech that Michael mentioned from October of 1943, same thing. We're not going to talk about that. But I think, Michael, that speech was recorded, correct?
Yeah.
So it's in the National Archive. So
you can go on YouTube and watch it they have the German and English translation as he's speaking. It's incredible.
So, I mean, and these things kind of complicate matters, so that when we as historians and classroom teachers are confronting this, I think it's an important aspect. And Michael mentioned the Wannsee Conference, and the Nazis themselves have these numbers, which are not really accurate either. Mm-hmm. And so we look at all these numbers together, and again, we get a sense of, all right, we're talking about somewhere in the ballpark of 6 million Jewish victims, intentional victims. And so why is that? Why is that number so huge? We look at that and we see, how it figures out. January 1942, Christopher Browning make this very clear. Another Holocaust scholar said, in January 42, 75% of those Jews who are going to be killed in the Holocaust are still alive. But by the time the Battle of Stalingrad ends in February 43, that percentage is reversed. Only 25% of those who are going to die in the Holocaust are still alive. So 1942 is a huge year of killing. So that helps us as historians to focus on, say, all right, what's going on? How is this possible? And again, we need the context of occupied Europe and where these Nazi death camps were in occupied Poland, all these things to help us understand these numbers.
So the 6 million, no, there's not even 6 million Jews in Germany. That's because it's all from all over.
You're talking Europe, right? I mean, just to be very clear, right? There were not 6 million Jews in Germany.
600,000 Jews in Germany.
Right, but we're talking about the Jews of Europe, and there were, I mean, again, estimates, but probably around 9 million Jews in Europe before World War II. 2 out of 3 Jews were killed. 2 out of 3 Jews in Europe were dead by the end of World War II.
I've never heard
that's
that
6 million.
So this is what I've heard in real life. I've had someone say this to me in person. The Diary of Anne Frank is a fraud. It was written in ballpoint pen, which is not common use until after her death.
Right. Yeah, the Anne Frank Museum has a whole rebuttal page on that that I would encourage listeners to read. It's quite instructive. Like any famous piece of writing, it has a history to it. And again, you can look for anomalies. How come that piece of paper looks like this, or that ink looks like that, or whatever. But people that know how to test paper and ink for dates have done so, and the diary is historical from that time period, not in the 1950s, is what the claim is made. Now, the fact that Anne Frank's father, Otto, did this and that editing process and so on in the 1950s, this is before the book was famous, and that is also part of the history of that work, but that has nothing to do with what actually happened in the original writing. And of course, she had multiple diaries. She was using different paper, different volumes that she was writing in. And that then, you just pick up a book at the bookstore, here it is. Well, that's not how it was originally. But again, they're just anomaly hunting. Let's see, find one little thing there.
Did he use a ballpoint pen and write?
No. I think as Michael said, I think the Anne Frank house notes that in the late 1950s, German handwriting experts were brought in to examine the document, the documents, the diaries, and there was a woman who made notes in a ballpoint pen, and her 2 pages of her notes ended up getting put into a folder with all these other kind of loose papers. And so when it comes out, oh, look, here's these 2 pages that are stuck in here. They're handwriting experts, so it's someone else's handwriting. And then, in fact, the woman came forward, or the son of the woman who wrote them came forward. And a lot of this, again, just was a federal criminal police investigation out of, I think it was Wiesbaden in Germany, that kind of brought this to the forefront and introduced this ballpoint pen thing. And but yeah, as Michael said, it's been debunked multiple times. And then the Dutch did forensic work beginning, I think, in the 1980s with experts, and concluded the same thing. She wrote in ink and colored pencil, and that was her writing. Ballpoint pen is somebody else's writing.
This is a claim that was very popular on YouTube a couple years ago. A very popular YouTuber made this claim. I'm not going to say who, but it was also part of a very famous podcast that gets a lot of listeners, which I won't say which one. But it's Hitler was a clean freak and a germaphobe. He had a revulsion to disgust and uncleanliness. He viewed the Jewish people, Romani, homosexuals, and more as just vermin that need to be cleansed. He wanted to make Europe clean. Again, clean freak. It was a natural progression. He actually started out by cleaning up cities, making hospitals more sanitary, and building new clean buildings.
Why won't you tell us where that you heard that? Wasn't this, is this on Rogan's show? Was this Kanye West?
Well, one of the things is I think is on Joe Rogan's show, I think it was Jordan Peterson that said this.
Oh, yeah. Well, so Hitler was okay. So he was something of a germaphobe.
A grain of salt. I know.
Yeah, but so what? Trump was a germaphobe.
Yeah, right. I mean, the two. What is the relationship between the two? Just because someone is a clean freak does not mean that they are entitled to commit genocide. It's
all right. Any more than Trump would, because he's a germaphobe. Although, so here's the deeper issue here in Holocaust debates over the decades was functionalism versus intentionalism. The intentionalists argued that early in the process, Hitler decided, maybe in the 1920s, maybe early 30s, he was going to exterminate European Jewry. Functionalists say, no, they initially just wanted to get Jews out of the Reich, and then functionally, as the war developed, they ended up going from, just deportation to ghettoization to extermination. And I think it's more of the latter. It's more of a complex system like that, passing it's like Milgram's 15 volts at a time, electric shock, how you get people to do this, one small step at a time. Euthanasia program, pass laws to exclude Jews from German life and so on. And then, a decade later, you've got them in ghettos, and then the war went well the first couple of years, so the Reich is expanding, and they're getting more Jews in contrast to the goal of let's send them off to Madagascar, which was one crazy plan. This is all failing, so we're not going to be able to just deport them and clean Europe, get rid of Jews from Europe. We're going to actually have to exterminate them. That was kind of the conclusion at the Wannsee conference.
This is another one I've heard in person before. And I know this all makes me sound like I hang out with really poor company. But I swear,
not at all.
Working at the First Amendment Museum, I talk to a lot of people and hear a lot of different things. So, but this one I've heard in person. It was impossible and at the end of the day, stupid for the Nazis to do anything like the Holocaust. Therefore, it didn't happen. Germany was fighting the US, the USSR, and the United Kingdom in a war of annihilation, an existential war. It doesn't make any sense that Germany would devote resources to committing something as grand and at such a huge scale as the Holocaust, especially if you're losing a war. Why would you waste resources and material and manpower that could have gone to the war effort on this big project? That doesn't make any sense. And sure that Germany may have employed some slave labor, but that Holocaust does not make, is the claim. So Robert, you're shaking your head. How would you take that one?
Yeah, I mean, again, so I had the privilege of working with Raoul Hilberg at the University of Vermont, and his 1961 book, The Destruction of European Jews, really kind of blows, the European Jewry blows the lid off of this, and in which he looks at the bureaucracy of destruction and, points out how trains carrying Jews to places like Treblinka or Belzec were given priority over troop trains in 1942 that were sending troops down over to the Eastern Front to fight the Soviets. We see this incredible effort that the Germans make at every level to prioritize the killing of the Jews over military expediency. And it's what I call conjoined war, a war of ideology and a military war. But Hilberg and so many others afterwards have shown that the Germans employed every aspect of their military and civilian bureaucracy to get the Jews taken out, rounded up, clothing, all the things that need to happen as a huge priority. And then, of course, Hitler, in his last will and testament, makes it a priority to continue this war against the Jews. And Goebbels, in all his speeches and in his diary, he's writing about these things again, that Hitler says we're going after the Jews. They're the cause of our misfortune, all these other things. So it's simply not true. It was actually more true to say it was a priority to kill Jews than it was to wage this war. And you could, make that statement and find a lot of examples of that. So
it did hamper their war effort.
Well, okay, two things. One, yes, it is stupid.
Ellen will go to you. Sorry. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, it was stupid. What are they doing that for? Well, because in Hitler's mind, that was the war. It's the war against the Jews, and he gave many speeches talking about this. That they are conducting a war against us. This is why we lost the First World War. The stab in the back conspiracy theory. The Jews were behind this. The Allies never even set foot on German soil. How is it we lost? This was the stab in the back. The Jews did this, so we have to fight back against the Jews. So in a way, that was part of the war effort. They considered the Jews to be the enemy, just like the Hun were the Russians and the Americans.
Ellen?
Yeah, just absolutely. Again, what Michael and Robert said, absolutely. This was part of, Hitler's ideology was, racial superiority, and Jews, along with some other groups, were the subhumans. And so kind of integral to the goals of the war was ridding Europe, ultimately the world, of these subhuman to the Nazis groups. And so that was a priority. It's kind of a false hypothesis to set that against the quote military objectives. In a way, that was one of the military objectives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So speaking of military objectives, so we understand that the SS and the Nazis, they were very bad, and they probably did this Holocaust, but the Wehrmacht, the German army, they were professional, they were clean, they just, maybe were just following orders sometimes, but they avoided engaging in genocide and ethnic cleansing.
Well, okay, when the Vermont was sweeping eastward, behind them was the Einsatzgruppe and the Special Action Forces, who were soldiers, whose job was to clean up the Jews out of the towns that the Vermont had conquered and kill all the Jews, and they did. So when I know you're going to ask about the gas chambers, over 1 million people, Jews, died at the hands of the Einsatzgruppe and with guns, right? You don't have to just have gas chambers, and that was part of it. So is that technically the Vermont? No, it's technically a branch of the SS, but we know that there were massive atrocities by the Vermont themselves, more along the lines of typical war atrocities, raping and pillaging and so on. And we know this also from Stalin, who basically told his soldiers, you're gonna get to do the same thing if you beat them that they're doing to us, right? And anyway.
So Robert, I want to go to you with this question next, but Ellen, I know you have a hard stop at 4:15.
Yeah.
Do you want to add any final thoughts on this topic? Anything you want to get out there? Sort of an open mic moment for you. And we can just edit it at the end to make it, I'll do this for Michael and Robert at the end, and then we'll just edit it to make it look like set it at the same time as them.
Right. Okay. Um, I think just say that, countering Holocaust denial and distortion is ever more important. And so spreading both accurate information about the Holocaust and understanding that all the things that we've been saying here in the last hour, a few errors here and there do not invalidate, you know, huge amounts of evidence to the contrary. Being alert to false hypotheses and statements that sound plausible, but as soon as you start to examine them or unpick them, there's nothing behind them. It's important to teach critical thinking, because to me, that's one of the most important ways that we can help counter all kinds of disinformation, including Holocaust distortion and denial. So for for me as Special Envoy for Holocaust issues, one of the things I try to do is just sort of rally support, raise awareness. This is a problem, but there are solutions. There are education, critical thinking, supporting accurate commemoration, history, and education about the Holocaust. It's a constant, it's a constant struggle. You can't just sit back, but it's possible to refute and push back against all of these claims. But it requires effort, and it requires some actual knowledge.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so Robert, clean Wehrmacht myth.
Yeah, a big lie. So just thinking about this, before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler had his legals create 3 what are called criminal orders in hindsight: the Barbarossa Jurisdiction Order, the Guidelines for the Troops in Russia, and the Commissar Order. Basically said, we're going to leave the Judge Advocate General at home. You can basically act with carte blanche on the suspicion of community harboring free shooters, partisans, Jews, whatever. You have permission, with as long as you get an officer's permission to blow up and destroy the entire village. I mean, they were given all this stuff. This is the regular German army, what are traditionally called the Wehrmacht, for the armed forces are given this. And then, as Michael pointed out, they're working hand in glove with the SS Einsatzgruppen and the Waffen SS in their killings on the Eastern Front. They're supporting them in their roundups and the shootings of Jewish victims. The whole POWs, the Commissar Order, they're just executing Jewish and other political officers on the spot, summary executions. So the Wehrmacht is very much not clean. My own personal research, one little town in Ukraine, a little shtetl called Jinkiv, where the 100th Light Infantry Division shows up, and they engage in 3 days of gratuitous terror and killings of the Jews there. Who know, all kinds of reasons why, but without any kind of reprisal or correction on the part of the military tribunals. And so when you have a group of soldiers who are given permission to act this way, it is no wonder then that they, working with the Einsatzgruppen and the police and SS units there, are going to do these things. And to me, interestingly enough, too, the late Peter Hoffmann, who wrote kind of the book on German resistance to the Nazis, makes note that among those who were caught in the July 20th 1944 plot to overthrow Hitler and the government, almost every one of those leaders cited treatment of the Jews by the German military, as well as the kind of broader German bureaucracy, as a reason to get involved in the resistance. And I think every member of the White Rose who were interviewed before they were executed, the student group out of Munich, said the same thing. So, and it's part and parcel of the kind of the documents that von Stauffenberg and Gödler and others wrote, who were part of this coup attempt put together in their kind of main statements that, yes, the treatment of the Jews has got to stop. And the Gestapo, who interrogated these guys and gals, concluded in their report, and I'm paraphrasing here, that these leaders wanted Jewish people across Europe to be considered the same as Germans. And that was abhorrent to the Nazi infrastructure. So the idea that the Wehrmacht was clean is a really bad myth. And again, I put that in the Cold War context that we talked about earlier, and other things with that, kind of the rehabilitation of these tank commanders and German generals to write these memoirs and get a lot of playtime, and intelligence officers and scientists being recruited to help the United States is just, I'm going to just say a sad commentary, but again, the reality that we face in hearing these kind of statements.
So Michael and Robert, we're coming up on, oh, go ahead, Ellen.
No, I'm just saying bye. I'm going to cut out.
Thank
now.
you so much. Yeah, Ellen, we appreciate it.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
I'll
Matt.
get that via email.
Bye.
Thank you. Robert, Michael, I know we're coming up 4:15. I don't want to be respectful of your guys' time. I have 3 more if you want to get through them, or if we need to stop here, that's okay.
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, so get into the gas chambers. Obviously, one of the most infamous, notorious aspects of the Holocaust. This is one I've never heard before, but I found online. American engineer and execution expert Fred Leuchter, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, Leuchter, proved that the so-called gas chambers at Auschwitz could not have been used for their alleged purpose. What is this about?
Yeah, so Fred Leuchter was a kind of a death gas chamber self-proclaimed expert. He was also an engineer who studied the electric, executions and so on. He's sort of Mr. Death. He had kind of this perverse obsession with executing people. Anyway, he came up during the Zundel trial. Ernst Zundel was a German expat living in Toronto, and he was prosecuted for hate speech under Canadian hate speech laws for Holocaust denial, which is another issue here that you probably deal with at your First Amendment museum there, but that's a separate one. So anyway, in Zundel's defense, he brought on Fred Leuchter, who went to Auschwitz and chipped off without permission some of the bricks that had Zyklon B staining on them. And the idea was, in his mind, if I can show that there's not enough Zyklon B staining in these bricks, then they could not have used Zyklon B to gas these prisoners. If they didn't use Zyklon B, that they didn't gas them, that the whole thing is a lie, and so on. That's the kind of typical argument. And so it became clear, though, because they brought in a forensic chemist who does these kind of things, like you dissolve something and tell people what's in it, right? What's the chemicals in this substance, right? And the problem is that Leuchter chipped off like a huge chunk, I don't know, something like this size of a brick, right? And the depth of which the Zyklon B gas is in there is just microns. So this forensic chemist is dissolving this entire, whatever it was, this kind of brick, it's brick, and so the Zyklon B level is just dissolved to next to nothing. So in the chemical report that Leuchter reports, it's like, well, there's almost no Zyklon B in there at all, but that's not true, because it doesn't soak in all the way through the brick, right? That was the problem with the Leuchter report. He was just simply wrong, right? His motives and all that is a separate issue, but he was wrong about that. And you can see this, go ahead.
No, sorry, Michael. Not only was he wrong, but he was not an engineer. He said he graduated from Northeastern, never graduated from Northeastern.
Right,
he said he was an engineer, wasn't an engineer. So, kind of intrepid reporters at the Jewish Advocate, a Newton, Massachusetts-based local paper, kind of uncovered that, as did a lot of other folks who did some great work to kind of blow that, as Mike was talking about, this guy. And in fact, made a movie of him in 2000. I think it's called Dr. Death. So
that was a Earl Morris film, very, very moving. Yeah. He interviews that chemist who explains what the problem was. Yeah, it was really good.
The other thing too, we talk about, kind of the corpus of evidence, is that deniers don't like to look at kind of the German records for how to build a better mousetrap. You start with the gas vans. How do you build a better gas van at Helmno? So they put out to bid these orders or offers to have German engineering companies develop a better gas van where the light won't break, or the balance of the weight of the van won't shift. If everyone tries to rush for the door will be reinforced, and have a place to clean out, human excrement and bodily fluids. All this stuff is put in there. The same with the gas chambers at the camps, and some of the camps are using carbon monoxide from captured Soviet aircraft engines, others using Cyclone B. So all of that stuff is in a meticulous series of records, and the deniers don't want to look at that as evidence to say, wow, the Germans are actually trying to come up with a quote unquote better way to kill people.
And Michael, you brought up what was it? No holes, no Holocaust. What is that?
Yeah. Okay. So at Auschwitz II, Birkenau, there were 4 crematoria, and there they had subterranean gas chambers with a roof and 4 holes on the roof that had these induction ports with wire mesh netting below it that you'd pour the Zyklon B pellets. The gas is embedded in the diatomaceous earth and then chopped up into pellets and put in these cans, and they pour it in there. So we have eyewitness accounts of SS guards getting up on the ceiling, opening the induction port and pouring the Zyklon B pellets there. Okay, we don't have film of that, but we have eyewitness tests. Okay, so if you go there, where are the holes in the ceiling? So this is Irving's argument, right? There's no holes. Well, so Alex and I went there. Yeah, there's no holes because the Nazis dynamited the gas chambers. It's just rubble. And even with that, I took some pictures there in my book. You can kind of see that may have been one of the holes, but you can see the induction ports in the construction photos that the SS took. I have pictures of that too. And you can see from the aerial photographs taken of Auschwitz when the Allies were bombing the IG Farben industrial plant at Auschwitz III. And you can see the shadows cast by the induction ports on the crematoria, on the gas chamber ceilings, along with the smokestack from the crematoria itself. You can see the shadows are all cast in the same way, and they match the 4 induction ports taken from the ground level photographs taken by the SS during construction of the gas chambers, right? So they're simply wrong about that, but that's a typical strategy. Like, there's no holes. If you go there, you won't find any holes. Well, duh, because they dynamite. It's just rubble, right? So it's a false argument.
This is one I've heard in real life. There is no way the Nazis burn all those bodies in the crematoria. Do you know how long it takes to burn a body? It literally would have been impossible to burn that many bodies in that time frame. I guess the time frame is the length of the Holocaust.
Yeah, well, okay, here's some photographs for you. Here's the Nazis burning bodies in open pits next to the crematoria because they often broke down. And we're not talking 6 million people were gassed, right? It's, as I mentioned, the million by the Einsatzgruppen with guns. And even that is an interesting backstory. It was difficult to get some of these guys to do the killing because initially they were putting the gun right up to the back of the person's head and brains splatter all over their suits and so on. And so then they tried different ones from a distance and so on. So in a way, the gassing was considered to be more humane, not for the victims, but for the perpetrators, right? I mean, it's crazy. And the gas chambers did break down occasionally. And, they weren't originally designed to do that. And then, again, German engineering, right, to put out for bid, we need a better gas chambers and so on, and better crematoria. I mean, and, they got that. And anyway.
But in addition to what Michael's saying, you've got a whole unit, Sonderaktion 1005, headed by the former head of Sonderkommando 4A, Paul Blobel, who is in charge of a unit from June of 42 until late of 44 that are going and digging up, exhuming bodies throughout occupied Europe and Eastern Europe, and they're burning them. And they are just trying to destroy these bodies. They're adding lime to so it's not just about burning. They've already put lime. They've already added things that have already been decay. And then they're bulldozing things over. And as Michael said, not everyone's killed in a gas chamber. But there are large places like at Babi Yar where 30,000+ Jews are murdered over a 3-day weekend in September of 41, headed by this guy Blobel himself, who was an SS major. You've got what are you going to do with those bodies? And so again, they're trying to hide the evidence from the advancing Soviets, and they're doing all they can. In this particular operation group 1005, their job was to make it all disappear, replant things, cover it up. And so there is a literal cover up that's happening, where they can't completely burn all the bodies themselves. And they're doing everything in their power to make this sort of disappear.
And I don't know if this is true. I'd be curious to get your response to this. For this, a response to this one I've heard is that they weren't doing a particularly amazing, like high quality job of burning the bodies, like how we imagine if someone gets cremated today, where they turn into like a nice fine powder. They were more concerned with just getting the thing destroyed, and it wasn't this nice fine powder that we think of today, and the process that goes into that. Is that true, or is that a bad response? You guys are like coaching me on my Holocaust denial response.
Well, I think Robert kind of addressed that with his description of the use of lime and so on. Yeah, it's not a perfect killing machine. Even Auschwitz was not originally intended to be an extermination camp. It was a labor camp. And they're putting Russian captured soldiers in Auschwitz, and then Jews, and then, again, it gradually shifts in a functional way from slave labor to extermination. And not all camps were extermination camps, really just 6 big ones. And so there's another revisionist tactic. After the war, they said there were something like 20 extermination camps, and now there's only 6. The rapidly disappearing Holocaust. Mauthausen, for example, was a slave labor camp. It was never an exterminationist camp. It did have a gas chamber. They did some experimental gassing there. They did burn bodies there, but it wasn't designed to exterminate, hundreds of thousands of people. And so what? But that's revisionism. That's real historical revisionism, right? You get more facts and figure out what's going on, and you write more books, publish more papers, and the story changes a little bit. But again, it's not like, it wasn't 6 million, it was 5.2 million or whatever. That's not 10,000 or 100,000 or 1 million. That's very different.
So last claim here, I can pretty obviously see the issues with this one, but with all of them, but especially this one. The Holocaust was actually just a myth to give the West an excuse to create the nation of Israel.
Well, the nation of Israel is, has a long history going back to the late 19th century, long before any of this. And in any case, the reparations paid by Germany to Israel, are based on the number. Let me see if I get this right. The number killed, right? Is that correct? And therefore, no, I'm flipping that story. Hang on, I forget that. Go ahead, Robert.
Well, no, I appreciate what you're saying, Michael. The other part of that, that my students have repeated to me, is that if the Germans really wanted to kill all these Jews, their German officials said they would have done so. And this is really an extortion to get the West Germans to do this. And this aspect of saying that the West Germans are underwriting the nation of Israel. And this is really the seed of what we might call anti-Zionist or anti-Israel Holocaust denial on the far left, because it diminishes the role, as Michael pointed out, of the Zionist movement that goes back to the 19th century, or even, you argue, the biblical times of beginning with King David, of the nation of Israel. And so these are, again, it's a lot of smoke and mirrors to get people to say, oh yeah, this is all just about, helping Israel get started and making people feel sorry for Israel, for Jews, and therefore you got to let Israel, kind of get created. Not true.
So though those were 10 or 11 Holocaust nihilist claims, Michael, I know you mentioned someone gave you a list of 39. I know we absolutely didn't address them all, but my sort of purpose in doing this was to, again, give examples of how these lies work, how these distortion works, how these claims work, some ways to refute them. And you guys did a wonderful job of doing that, of sort of crushing these arguments that I laid out. And I was really inspired to do this talk, just to pontificate for a second. Someone told me that this was a pointless talk to have because addressing Holocaust denialist claims is like talking to a flat earther. And then I realized I couldn't think of a way to prove the Earth is round when they
That's
said
right.
that. I was like, well, I don't
Yeah.
even know why the Earth is
We
round.
need to address the flat earthers claims, and we do.
So then I went and I Googled
Yeah.
how we know
Yeah.
the Earth is round. And I was like, well,
Actually, there's studies
photographs.
on this. Most people cannot explain why why we know the world is round, or any other basic facts of nature. It's astonishing.
Yeah. So I thought it was important. That made me feel like, well, I didn't feel like that was a good argument he gave me. So I said, this is, if someone I've heard some of these arguments before and I don't know what to say to them. But I want to give you guys, sort of like I did with Ellen, an open mic moment, whether you want to promote anything you do, anything you've got going on, any ways people can learn more, any last messages. We'll go Robert, then Michael.
Yeah, you asked us to prepare a little bit for this, and in thinking about this topic, I'm reminded of a line from Isabel Wilkerson's 2020 book on caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, in which she describes a house that has rot and problems. And, as owners of this house, we could say, well, we didn't cause the rot. But it's our responsibility to do something about it if we don't want things to continue this way. And we are kind of faced, as we've talked about before, with quite a bit of rot that's out there about Holocaust denial and distortion, this quasi-revisionism, pseudoscientific studies that Michael mentioned. And I really want to echo what Ellen's points here. This is a multi-level job. It's not just for those like Michael who are publishing magazines and have books on the subject, or those of us in the classroom, or those in the diplomatic corps. This is something that goes to a lot of aspects, education, to museums, to civic organizations, to the military, to law enforcement, to run these kinds of programs to challenge us. I like Brave Little State is a podcast that Vermont Public Radio has, and one of their kind of taglines is "Be brave, ask questions." And I think there's great merit in asking questions and being willing to look at those questions. I cannot tell you how many times encountering, people who share these claims that this never happened. I'm reminded of a story that I work with my students on called The Ballad of Dickie Donaldson. And Dickie Donaldson is a guy who was devastated the Red Sox lost the World Series to the Mets in 1986. And then he saw some kids in a developing country wearing shirts that said 1986 World Series champion Red Sox. And it just flipped him. And he said, my gosh, the Red Sox really won the 86 World Series, and it must be a cover-up. It didn't take till 2004 for the Sox to win the first World Series since 1918. And so we're challenged. We have to ask questions. How can this guy think this way? And he's a fictitious character, but there are people like him who claim that the 1986 series was really Red Sox win. They were one strike from winning. How could they possibly lose? In Game 6, they're ready to clinch. So it's that kind of thing. I also deal with, we look at the Goyim Defense League and all these other kind of Patriot Front and a lot of the Proud Boys and all these organizations that are spewing hate and Christian nationalism, and how many churches not only in this country but around the world teach that the most famous Jewish guy is Jesus. What would that do to Christian nationalism if people thought about that bumper sticker, about Jesus as a Jewish carpenter? Wow, he's identified as a Jew. He's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. What would that do to upset the apple cart, to extend? And again, it's that aspect of challenging people. When I was interviewing for a job as a head of a nonprofit Holocaust Center and Human Rights Center, someone asked me, hey, Dr. Bernheim, how do you reach those people who live in a small town in this rural state and they go to basketball games twice a week and they're really not interested in the Holocaust and human rights? How do you get them interested in that? And it's a question that I'm perpetually wrestling with. But one of the ways you get them interested is, again, to find a place that they can relate to. And for me, that involves stories. And I think what Michael writes about and what Ellen is doing, these kinds of things we teach in the classroom, engaging stories that will bring people in, because we remember stories a lot more than we remember statistics. And Michael's in this work of, how do you get people to change their mind on things? And that's really important stuff. But being able to be honest, humble, compassionate in our conversations with us, and not like the hammer that says, I know, and you better believe this and change your mind, goes a long way to advancing a conversation that actually might make a difference in changing people's attitudes and approaches. So I'm going to get off my soapbox and turn it over to
Thank you, Robert. Michael.
Yeah, that's nicely put, Robert. Yes. Yeah, I always wondered about the business about the Jews killed our Lord. It's like, he was Jewish, right? It's like, and besides that, he had to die to save you from your sins. So wasn't that a good thing? Shouldn't you be praising the Jews or the Romans for killing Jesus? That's another story.
A whole other episode.
Yeah. But I would say, the First Amendment, back to the First Amendment, this is important for a couple of reasons. First, we should be free to talk about anything we want. And here we are. We're talking about Holocaust denial and or vaccine denial if you want, or climate denial, whatever. Just bring it up. Let everybody have their say. And then if they're wrong, point out how they're wrong. That's unusual still, even in the modern world. Holocaust denial is illegal in a great many countries, including Canada and New Zealand, Australia, France, Germany, Austria. David Irving was arrested at the Austrian airport for going to give a talk on World War II, whatever it was. He's going to give his typical revisionist talk. And, so he didn't even give the talk. He was arrested essentially for a thought crime. I find that appalling, right? It's like banning Mein Kampf. Well, this banning is not going to help, because the ideas are out there anyway. And you're not going to change the mind of hardcore believers in this, but the undecided voters, let's call them, the people that, just don't know much about it at all. And they see this story like, oh, this guy's being silenced. Why is he being silenced? And maybe he's onto something. You see this recently with Robert Kennedy Jr. and his anti-vax movement. It's like, why do they want to silence Robert Kennedy Jr.? He must be onto something, right? And so that has a backfire effect. And so I say, let Irving and these guys say whatever they want to say. Let them publish their newsletters. Let them meet in their little hotel conference rooms, which is where I've met them. And it's like, it's not a huge threat. And in any case, just debunk them. And if there's a few Proud Boys or whatever that still believe it, well, we can't change everybody's mind. But again, we can reach the people that don't know much about it. They think, yeah, maybe there is something to that. What's the explanation for that? And then they read it and they go, oh, okay, never mind. I have to worry about that. Right. So that's the importance of free speech as a First Amendment issue. And again, I'm not required to publish their works, but I can rebut them if I want, and I do. And that seems to be the solution, the best solution we can come up with.
Thank you both for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. I will be in touch as this moves forward. I'm going to send this over to Megan, my coworker, who's going to edit out the bits where I'm like, okay, Ellen's late, or leave early.
Okay. Yeah.
You guys were a wealth of knowledge. I certainly learned a lot as sort of proof positive of this dialogue. I'm not a Holocaust denier, but I learned so much about the Holocaust, and I read a lot of books about it, and even so I learned a ton. So thank you guys so much for doing this. We, again, I said this in my email, but we really can't do the work we do here without people like you guys volunteering your time and effort. So I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the opportunity. Great to serve with Michael and Ellen.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.